In this presentation, I would like to study the role of the translation of foreign literature in the autonomization of the Argentinian literary field and in the construction of a national and also a regional and international identity in the first half of the 20th century by focusing on a long-lasting Argentinian magazine, Revista Nosotros. This presentation is part of my postdoctoral research, which I am conducting at the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya with the project Social Network of the Past, Mapping Hispanic and Lusophone Literary Modernity, led by Diana Roig-San and funded by the European Research Council. This project aims to set the grounds for a new approach to exploring transnational cultural transformation processes in Iberoamerica from 1898 to 1959, using big data tools to develop a relational database. My postdoctoral research focuses on the presence of literary translation in periodical publications. Without a doubt, periodical publication played an important role in cultural transfer in this period, as many important works from the beginning of the 20th century were first published in journals. For instance, the first Spanish translation of some extract of James Joyce's Ulysses and Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own were published for the first time in Argentinian journals such as Proa and Sur. New movements and trends, intellectual debate, and the national or international recognition of certain authors and literary genres were discussed in these media. Therefore, it seemed important to map the international circulation of foreign literature in Hispanic and Lusophone journals and to identify what kind of books and authors were channeled through translation and critical reviews. In the Argentinian periodical realm of the first half of the 20th century, the literary magazine model inspired by European examples such as Nouvelle Revue Française, Criterion, and Revista d'Occidente gave way to the creation of similar experiences that were closer to a limited conception of culture or literature. In this sense, two well-known magazines are generally mentioned, Proa and Sur, both of which placed the translation of contemporary foreign literature at the core of their cosmopolitan interest. While translation in Proa and Sur are more studied and therefore better known, Nosotros remains unexplored from this point of view, possibly because Nosotros was considered, perhaps oversimplistically, a nationalistic organ, implying that it lacked translation in its pages. However, I do not wish to reinforce the binary opposition between national, no translation, and cosmopolitan, with translation publications. On the contrary, my aim is to study how contact with foreign literature contribute to the national and regional debate in Nosotros. Before studying how translation is present in Nosotros, we should address the publication itself. The magazine was founded in 1907 and subsisted until 1943. It was founded by two young friends, Roberto Giusti and Alfredo Bianchi, both born in Italy, who were students at the Facultad de Filosofía y Letras, Faculty of Literature and Philosophy in Buenos Aires. The magazine Nosotros is key to understanding how the Argentinian literary field consolidated itself and gained autonomy at the beginning of the 20th century, sparking the emergence of the artist ideology and the new kind of writer whose identity was deeply tied to their writing practice and often linked to journalism, though detached from the political and religious fields in which the previous generation from the 1880s participated. Thus, the publication provides a privileged vantage point for debates on the emergence of the national literary fields. This concern for the incipient autonomization of the Argentinian intellectual field can be traced back to a number of the magazine features, including the following. And here you have the summary of these features, and I move directly to point 1. The presence of young local talent alongside renewed authors, as stated in the first issue, editor's notes. The director's goal is none other than to allow older consecrated writers to commune with new and already recognized writers. In fact, Bourdieu notes that in the constitution of a field, the battles between agents aiming to appropriate the specific capital at play are not excessively hard, since no agent seeks to attack the emergence and constitution of the field itself, a more tolerant atmosphere takes hold. In this sense, Nosotros considered itself a tolerant magazine, inclusive and eclectic. It defended the right to free speech. Indeed, the magazine offers fine literature and high culture in a gesture that could be considered inclusive elitism. Now, this tolerance was locked within non-negotiable boundaries. The magazine did not allow literature to mix with politics and religion. This limitation might also be viewed as a consequence of the magazine's desire to autonomize the intellectual field. In its statutes, the magazine defined itself as apolitical and impartial. Politics were not to enter its pages, but the political events that took the beginning of the 20th century raised questions around this principle, leading to discussion and controversy. For instance, an article written as an homage to the socialist Jean Jaurès was heavily criticized by the magazine's more conservative wing. On politicals also caused resignation, as was the case with one of the directors, Roberto Giusti, who in 1920 stated that he needed to take side and stop concealing his sympathy for the Russian Revolution and his affiliation with the Socialist Party. Another significant feature of Nosotros was its aim to capture the intellectual environment. Nosotros was essentially a space for intellectual socialization through the magazine itself, of course, but also through a variety of events and networks of periodical publications. In terms of events, Nosotros organized gatherings in cafes, banquets, homage to national and Latin American authors such as Rodó and Darío, conferences with distinguished speakers, including the Italian poet Marinetti, or the American novelist Waldo Frank, who, like the magazine, criticized Yankees' capitalist expansion. Furthermore, Nosotros introduced the modern survey format in its page to understand certain issues. For instance, are women more cultured than men? Or what is the value of Martin Fierro? Both in their response to these surveys and in other collaboration, we may observe how Nosotros consolidate an international network of Argentine, Latin American, and Spanish writers, such as Rafael Obligado, Carlos Ibarguren, Alfredo Palacios, José Ingenieros, Manuel Galvez, among others from Argentina, Alfonso Reyes, Pedro Enríquez Ureña, José Vasconcelos, Gabriela Mistral from Latin America, and Unamuno or Eugenio Díaz Romero from Spain. This interest in building an international exchange network is also clear in the publication mentioned in Nosotros, as you see. From Europe, La Lectura, Revista de Occidente from Spain, La Critica from Italy, La Revue de Deux Mondes, Le Mercure de France, La Nouvelle Revue Française, and Europe from France, or from Latin America, for instance, El Convivio, La Cultura Cuba Contemporánea. Nosotros was interested in creating a broad and reading public. This magazine targeted the middle and immigrant class, and in fact, many of its collaborators were part of this class and wrote for an educated audience that includes students, professors, and middle-class intellectuals in order to take, and I quote, on a broader and more complex cultural operation, the founding of the modern Argentina, as Rivera notes. The magazine promotes the professionalization of the writers as a condition for the autonomy of the literary field. This concern can be traced back to the topic addressed in the magazine, such as how hard it was to get published by local publishing houses, payments for journalists, the creation of the Argentine Literature Chair in the Faculty of Literature in 1912, the project that aimed to create a society of writers, and so on. In fact, literary criticism was central to the writer's professionalization in Nosotros, and also key to consolidating the national literature. For instance, we could mention the debate about Martin Fierro's place as a national epic poem, as compared to France's La Chanson de Roland. Indeed, the practice of literary criticism was considered exclusive to the man of letters, as we may read in the complaint that editor issued regarding the jury in charge of awarding National Literary Prize, which include multiple public servants and lawyers. The editor stated that, to nosotros, literary works can only be judged with authority and comment by literary professionals. In nosotros, we find a lot of critics and reviews of national works with authors such as Galvez, Lugones, Guiraldes, Borges, and among others, with the goal of consolidating Argentine literature. However, many critics of foreign works were also published, as you see here in this table. In fact, the magazine defends an American nationalism. The idea is that the magazine was interested in defending Argentine literature, but not in isolating this literature from its context. Instead, the literature was to be read in relation to Latin American literature. This became explicit in the statement that nosotros aim, and I quote, to be more than Argentinian magazine and Latin American magazine, or another quotation, there is nothing we need more urgently than to create solid ties between South America's isolated cultural centers. Furthermore, nosotros boosted relationship to Europe's Latin country, as they say, and these countries are France, Italy, and Spain. Criticism in nosotros boasts a central and highly specialized role, but what role did the translation of foreign literature play? To visualize data on translation, I am working on relational database for social network analysis based on the digital environment node code. My sources for this presentation include the summary Bibliografía Argentina de Artes y Letras by Elena Ardizone and Nélida Salvador, as well as the Nosotros collection digitized by the Ibero-American Institute of Berlin, and the useful portal of cultural magazines Revistas Culturales 2.0 created by Professor Anno Ehrlicher. The data on literary translation has been entered manually, having selected some specific fields from the Ardizone Salvador summary, such as literary genre, in the entries related to what the index labels classics and modern literatures. In terms of the source languages of translated, at the first glance, nosotros appears to include few translations. If we consider that between 1907 and 1943 we have a provisional registry of 128 translations, adding those effectively declared to those that are likely, the figures seem small. Nonetheless, a more attentive study of this translation could provide interesting information on the relationship between the magazine and foreign literature. My goal here is to trace how, through foreign literature, Nosotros was able to position itself ideologically and politically, both locally and internationally. If we view this translation in time, we may observe that translation pointed in 1920s. Interestingly, in 1920, Roberto Giusti quit his position as director. His resignation, which stemmed from political issues surrounding his affiliation with Socialist Party, he noted that the magazine was living through years of opening and should thus position itself as a publication of the avant-garde. Around this year, several more cosmopolitan magazines appeared, such as Proa and Martin Fierro. In terms of the source languages of translated text, we may observe a wide variety of origins, with French being the first by far, followed by English, Italian, German, and Catalan. In fact, the magazine boasted sections dedicated to French, Portuguese, Italian, Catalan, and Latin American literature. In this graph, one piece of information stands out. Spanish appears as source languages 3 times. implying that the publication languages must have been something other than Spanish. This might be better understood by observing the following graph. Besides including Spanish as a target languages, other languages also appear, especially Italian and French. First, I would like to consider the peculiar Italian case. These were not publications of Italian authors, as one might suspect, although some Italian authors were published in translation, such as Dante, Presolini, Leopardi, Carducci, Lamberti, and so on, but of Latin American authors translated to the Italian. Comunardo Braccialarghe translated these works. He also went by the pseudonym Folco Testena in, for example, the translation of Martin Fierro for the magazine publishing house. In the magazine, Braccialarghe translates poetry by Rubén Darío, Notturno, and also a poem called Chiocciola, and Raffaele Obligado, the poem Il Nido di Boyeros, to the Italian. He also wrote poetry in Italian as an homage to Latin American authors such as José Ingenieros and Amado Nervo. Likewise, he published criticism of contemporary Italian literature, commenting on the best-selling authors of the time, Virgilio Brocchi, and others authors as Alba Trelli and Levi Esro, as well as the article Italian Literature, its influence on Argentine literature during the first quarter of the century. The fact that the Italian was not only present in reviews but also in translation of Latin American literature can be explained by the importance of immigration for the middle class at the beginning of the century. In this sense, the magazine exposed the foreigners' integration in opposition to more conservative ideas stemming from the Creole nationalist reaction. That Giusti affirmed the following: our history will be constructed upon the enormous mass of foreigners who will lay out their new nationality here. Buenos Aires will be proud to see not only Moreno, Rivadavia, and San Martin in its plazas, but also, and why not, Karl Marx, Émile Zola, and Leo Tolstoy, the champions of new ideals. In this magazine, the influence of foreign literature would also contribute to forge the identity and cultural history of the Argentine nation. As we have observed, another of the publication languages in the graph is French. Above all, the magazine published French poetry by the following author: Charles de Soussan, who was a Swiss author living in Argentina who was part of the Bohemia and actively collaborated with the magazine, Nicolas Baudouin, Marcel Auclair, or Raymond Manigaud. To date, we have found 44 of translation from the French to Spanish with abundant criticism of the post-war French literature of the time, such as criticism by Francis de Miomandre, who was also published works in La Gaceta Literaria in Spain and led the Crónica de la Vida Intelectual Francesa, Chronicles of French Intellectual Life section. The magazine also contained review and translation of works by the writer group Clarté, which fought to push intellectuals to commit to pacifism during the post-war years and was strong to the ideals of the Russian Revolution. Nosotros published and reviewed works by the following: Henri Barbus, Romain Rolland, and also Anatole France. For instance, about Anatole France, in January 1922, the author's Nobel Prize acceptance speech was published. Given his death, a number of critical articles on his philosophy and works were authored by several of Nosotros writers, such as Giusti, Miomandre, Reisig, Ibarguren, among others. And the visitation speech Anatole France in Buenos Aires, a banquet of youth, was published in October 1994. Furthermore, the magazine published translation of France texts such as Si no se quiere parecer, an article France wrote about the League of Nations, published in Clarté, and the text to the intellectual and student of Latin America, which the author wrote with Barbus, and a translated letter from France to the director of L'Humanité. In fact, the magazine's closer relationship with Clarté authors caused problems with Nosotros' more conservative writers, who accused the director of supporting a group of communists, despite the fact that, according to its statutes, the magazine was to remain apolitical. In terms of French translation, It is also worth noting that the magazine published poems by authors such as Albert Samin, André Chénier, Paul Verlaine, de Bigny, Musset, Proust, Rimbaud, Marinetti, Leconte de Lille, and so on. One director, Alfredo Bianchi, also translates literature. For instance, he translates poetry by Marinetti, written in French, and Oscar Wilde, De Profundis, which had not been published before, and critical articles by Nicolas Baudouin and Pierre Abraham. Notably, even at the beginning of the 20th century, the director considered translation an act of literary creation, as we see in this quotation about the need to prize translation alongside original Argentine literature. And I quote only one sentence, and translation can be a masterwork of recreation. Lastly, in terms of France, the country provides a model. As I quote, en France, the eternal teacher of liberty, they say. In fact, the magazine copied Mercure de France as an example, though not in its content, given that Nosotros aim to provide a more Americanist perspective. Mercure de France complements Nosotros in 1914 on its ability to sustain autonomous and independent literary and aesthetic criteria. A counterexample would be Revue Sud-Américaine, as you see, founded by the Argentinian poet Leopoldo Lugones in Paris. Nosotros criticized this publication due to its Eurocentric character, as it appeared to be disguised as French, as they say, without intending to change the intellectual environment at the local level, which, as noted previously, was one of Nosotros' goals. Finally, it is worth mentioning that Nosotros also published Russian texts, given the magazine penchant for the revolution and the novelty of the Soviet model in the 20s and 30s. While the magazine was to be apolitical, given its very statutes, translation allowed for difference, as texts could be published without the magazine having to explicitly subscribe to any given idea. The contemporary critics and poets that the magazine published include the following: Ustinov, Berezovsky, Ebreinov, Yarochevsky, and here you have the title of article from these critics and authors, and the magazine editors published an homage to the poet Vladimir Mayakovsky on the occasion of his suicide in 1939, studying the Soviet case from a far more critical and less laudatory perspective. You can read in this sentence. Lastly, beside the contemporary European literature, we may find translation of what was then called universal literature, but was actually just a European canon of authors: Shakespeare, Goethe, Dante, Byron, Shelley, and even Roman classics like Virgil. One final inserting point is who Nosotros translators actually were. Mostly men who, and you can see the names here in this table, men who also wrote criticism, reviews, and their own works. Translation was not seen as a specific profession, but as yet another editorial and creative task that collaborators who spoke more than one language would take on sporadically. Often, these publications were accompanied by the translation comments. And here you have an image of the constellation of collaborators of Nosotros. Well, in order to conclude, essentially, in this presentation, I have sought to show how the translation of foreign literature can influence the debate about autonomizing the local intellectual field and about national reivindication. Paradoxically, but not inconsistently, the magazine analyzed here Nosotros sought to portray international nationalism. It defends the institutionalization of national literature while creating a network of international exchange. Furthermore, while the magazine emphasized literary criticism as the proper task for the new professional Argentinian writer of the early 20th century, the translation of foreign contemporary work indirectly allowed these writers to take political sides, going against the provision in the magazine statutes. Nosotros was to be an impartial and apolitical magazine. Nonetheless, its translation of contemporary authors, especially of the group Clarté and of Russian literature, as well as the translation to the Italian published in its page, suggests that this magazine was situated in its time, showing interest in political events, whether international, such as the Russian Revolution, or national, such as the inclusion of immigrants in the forging of a national identity. Thus, it is my belief that Nosotros is an excellent example of how, when it comes to Latin American literature, the national issue cannot be divorced from the regional and the international ones. Here you have my references. And thank you so much.